biggest thing they've ever done by far. It's a big program.
In terms of popularity, yeah. You mentioned that.
Your cell phone getting it? Yeah.
Yes, so you can get
really needed to look like home.
So UVerse has the 20 numbers you can block. I filled my list up.
Yeah, I'm actually finally decided to port my home number over to cell phone because I can block more than a second.
Oh yeah.
I like the fact that that's the because. It's like, oh, sorry, can't use yours anymore. Can't block enough numbers. Test 1, 2. Is that coming through?
So these are the only microphones that are hot, of course.
Yeah, Dan York replied in Jabber saying that he can hear us. All right, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. You're in the modern office. That's not where you expect to be. Go ahead and take off now. Real quick before we start, I want to point out we have a couple of people in here from the Nonprofit Consumers Union, and they would like to videotape the session. If anyone has objections to that, please stand up and say something to the microphone now.
Will that be videotaped?
Okay, let's go ahead and get started then. Good. Yeah. So, note well statement. If this does not mean something to you, please lean over to the person next to you and ask what's it about. You also received a copy of this with your meeting materials, so it shouldn't be news. Go ahead. Sorry? I'm sorry, you're right. We don't hand out big sheets of paper anymore. So we have already Steve Donovan. Sorry? I do hand out blue sheets, yes. We already have Steve Donovan taking notes for us. I would like a backup note taker. Can I find volunteers?
Volunteers, go.
Excellent, thank you very much. So we have a second note taker, and just to make sure, I do know we appear to have at least one remote participant. If questions come up in the Jabber room, we need someone to take them to the microphone. Can I find a volunteer to monitor the Jabber room? Thank you, Richard. All right, and then Richard just started the blue sheets. I believe that's everything we need here. There was one more thing. Yeah, no, I think that's it. Okay, let's go ahead and get Henning up here to talk to us about telephone numbering and IP.
You're going to be operating me.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm told to tell you to stand in the red box. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. First of all, I'm surprised. First of all, I'm surprised the early morning interest in telephone numbers, which usually, at least where in the building I work, has somewhat of a boring reputation. So I should preface that with saying, while I do work at the FCC, only the commissioners speak for the FCC, so these are my personal opinions. Next, please. So what I want to do today is just give a little bit of background on why telephone numbers are still relevant, why do we bother, what are some of my assumptions going in terms of presentation here, as well as possibly on a going forward basis what we might use the time that we have productively. And then I'll talk a bit about a change of perspectives that are starting to happen simply because of the transition to IP, where many of the assumptions that we've traditionally made about how telephone networks work are just no longer quite true. So there's an opportunity here to do two things, namely, one, to look at these old assumptions again and see where we can simplify, where we can essentially make things work better, where there are peculiar artifacts of the existing numbering systems that made a whole lot of sense in, say, 1996, when the last major telecom reform was done in the United States, but may not really make a whole lot of sense today in a largely mobile voice over IP, landline, or voice over VoLTE type environment, multimedia environment, and so on. And then I'll talk about the two aspects of numbering, namely what kind of data do we need and what kind of operations do we need to manage the data itself. The data itself is not terribly interesting in some ways, but the operations are somewhat unusual simply because they have underlying business processes that are demanded by consumer protection, regulatory concerns, business models, and so on. Obviously, the business models, regulatory concerns, and so on are largely outside the scope, but they essentially form requirements that we presumably would want to abstract. And lastly, I do want to point out, simply because I'm much more familiar with US and +1 numbering systems than I am with others, and because I can get lots of data on those numbers that I can't as easily get elsewhere, I'm going to be biased towards US examples. Don't take that as anything except my lack of knowledge of what happens elsewhere. And I hope that there are people in the room who have non-US perspectives and experience as well. My general take is that some of the issues, namely the IP transition, the notion of portability of numbers, are becoming fairly universal. Concerns about security, concerns about robocall, all of these type of things. They used to be somewhat US specific, but within the past few years they've been pretty universal, at least in many countries with a fairly developed telecom system. Next, please. So when we look at telephone numbers, one interesting thing that has happened is even though we've had the same basic telephone numbers in most countries, changing digit lengths and all that, leaving that aside, for decades now, the role of telephone numbers has changed fairly fundamentally. And that's been an incremental change. So where we started out, this is a not particularly good picture of a Strauger switch, where essentially telephone numbers were instructions to motors as to how many steps they should rotate to make a connection between an incoming line and an outgoing line. So they directly tied to a physical operation of an electromechanical switch. Now obviously that has gone away. Then, more recently, it really has become an identifier in that. Yes, I did pick the business card by not completely unintentionally. And so the idea there, and this is actually an old telephone number. You can't read that. It's called Brian something or other when they had when they still had central office names. And so those are largely identifiers decoupled from the location or other mechanical details, mobility, all of these type of things. They're in IETF terminology, an identifier, not a locator anymore. So the same number string started out very much as a locator, slowly transitioned to an identifier. And then as people put business cards into address books, as most people don't really see telephone numbers anymore when they dial because they just use their Android or iPhone type address book, it has become largely as what I would see as kind of the intermediate identifier. Namely, it's the thing you can post on a lamppost when your cat has gone missing. And because that person won't be in the address book of the cat finder, so you have to have that in a way that you can easily type in and possibly even remember in that, if you don't want to use an email address or something else like that. So the number hasn't changed, the role has changed, but we have many artifacts left where, for example, the remnants of the locator model are still visible simply because we have sometimes things are tied geographically or to a switch in some obscure parts of emergency calling, old PSAPs, for example, that have limited digit lengths, all of that. And Keith?
Sorry, Keith Drage. I mean, I don't think it's a matter of the role has changed. It's gained additional roles, but I think all those original roles still exist. And I can think of at least 2 or 3 more that you haven't even mentioned yet. So.
Okay, I'll take that as a fair point. Okay, good. Next, please. So one of the question that whenever I start talking about phone numbers is people stand up. We'll see that if that happens here. That's it. Well, I mean, phone numbers are so 1950s. 10 years from now, nobody will be babbling with phone numbers for all the reasons that I kind of alluded to, is they're no longer visible, people don't make phone calls, all of that. The problem that we have is if you look at, and I'm not going to go through the list of criteria here in detail, but if you look at identifiers in general, we have fundamental trade-offs where if we didn't have phone numbers, we'd probably have to invent something that probably looked pretty close to what phone numbers have at least evolved to in the identifier role. Namely, we want something, at least as an option, that is protocol independent, supports multimedia, is portable, allows addressing both groups and individuals, kind of a logical identifier that's not tied to just one device, for example, that avoids, at least to the extent possible, trademark issues, is internationally usable, and provides at least a modicum of privacy so that it doesn't disclose more than necessary to the recipient than you would want to disclose at that particular time. Next, please. So what we need is an identifier that can work on different media, based on the back of a truck or a cat poster that we can convey orally. And if you've ever tried to spell out an email address, which is somewhat unusual, you know that the likelihood that it will actually be correct is fairly low. Can work internationally. So I took a Chinese poster, but the only thing I can read on that is the telephone number. Is portable across organization. That means if you have a cell phone, you don't have to change it when you change jobs, for example. Does not reveal too much about the holder of that number, and it's been useful, that's not a requirement, provides some rough hint as to where the person is. And that is useful to avoid the unintentional call somebody at 2 in the morning type of problem. Again, this is not a perfect thing, but it turns out to be somewhat useful. We do look at that and say, if I see a European number, I have some inclination that more likely than not, probably calling them after 6 p.m. Eastern is a pretty bad idea unless I know something about the person. Yes, please.
Andrew Allen, I don't think it's just time zone, but it also gives you a hint as to how much you're going to pay.
That is
and
another...
the same thing with the free phone numbers, right? You know that an 800 or an 866 number is a free phone number as well, and that's useful information to know.
And I'm looking forward to the note taker because I'll be creating a second revision of the slides because I'm sure we'll be talking about that again. So what we have is if you take those requirements, you have internationalization that pretty much means the only thing that is reasonably universally understood across character sets and languages tend to be Arabic numerals, even though they may not be native to the country, they may have their own numbering system, but at least most people in most countries seem to understand Arabic numerals. Yes.
Hi, it's Eric Berger. So on this slide, and actually on the slide before, there's another thing that I would offer the assertion is actually the opposite, which is the top picture there. People are using names for numbers, which means 50 years before ICANN came up with IDRPs for trademark stuff, we've had disputes in the United States over people who got vanity phone numbers that look like somebody else's trademark.
Yep.
So those issues are even all over here, even though we think they're just numbers.
Right. I mean, again, I don't want to, this is probably less relevant since we're not debating, I mean, the value of it. There are trademark issues compared to domain names. I think for most individuals, they tend to be less. Not that, I mean, 1-800-GOT-JUNK, for example, they would be really upset if that somebody else took that. So.
Chris Wendt, Comcast. Along similar lines, I'm wondering, you know, if you can make the argument that telephone numbers are more convenient or more rememberable. You know, why aren't they adopted by Facebooks and Twitters? You know, they could easily use telephone style numbers or things like that. I think there's something compelling about textual things. And on your last slide, you said that telephone numbers are protocol independent. People use email addresses for lots of different protocols as identifiers. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, but my email addresses, again, I don't think that's, I want to get into a long debate on that.
User at domain.
I'm sorry?
Or just user at domain.
Yeah.
So this part of the presentation is actually rather introductory. I think if we could go ahead and stop making an awful lot of comments on the specific parts of this.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the fine points of mine. If I write a dissertation on phone numbers, I'm sure to include your comments on that. So take that with a, if it's 95% correct, even though you can think of exceptions, tell me privately.
Henning, I'm going to, as an exception to the rule, actually one of the most important things about phone numbers, they're linguistically neutral.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was implying. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So they're portable. So because there's no provider domain, unlike a Facebook identifier, I can't use, in all likelihood, my Facebook identifier on Google Plus, if I decided to switch to that particular one. They're reasonably private, obviously not, they're identifying you, they're not, they track you, but they don't include your name or any other type of information, your company or whatever else in that. Obviously you have caller name delivery, I'll leave that aside. You have a geography model for the reasons we mentioned. So the two alternatives that I've heard that might emerge that will render phone numbers at least somewhat less relevant or even increasingly irrelevant would be if we get to an all-app world. And there are people that used to be in these type of rooms that now work for Cisco that have made claims that that's what we're working towards. That why bother about standards? We can just all download our individual apps, so we can just use identifiers within the particular app. That may happen in that. Or the opposite of that is that we don't bother with numbers that have human scale, that are in some sense writable, all that. If all identifiers are being conveyed mechanically in some way, then why not just use public keys, for example, and then you don't have to bother with assignment, you just generate one and you don't worry about collisions or any of the other things that make number assignment interesting. Next, please. So one issue, and I don't want to belabor that because it's a different one, is that there has also been a fair amount of interest for reasons both good and not so good. And you assign numbers not just to people, but also to various devices, primarily devices that have a cellular interface. That has to do with the use of SIM cards, it has to use with billing systems that use telephone numbers internally, or something that looks like telephone numbers. All of these type of things have found themselves at least potentially using telephone numbers. That puts some pressure on number assignment. Fortunately, I believe the number assignment, at least in most countries, is the number of these objects that I can think of would actually get numbers is actually not that large. So whether that's a problem or not, I'm not convinced it's going to kill the telephone number as a usable identifier. Obviously, if every light switch gets one, but no serious person has proposed putting a 4G modem in every light switch either. So,
well, just to say, Henning, Andrew Allen again. 3GPP has done a work item to be able for machine-to-machine communications to not have to use E.164 numbers for that communication. So it is perceived as a potential problem.
If it is particularly mean, if you have truly large numbers of devices, not just 5 million parking meters or 45 million light posts, but a large number of sensors and so on. Okay, next one. Just yesterday, we had a news article in the New York Times, which it seemed like a pretty odd way to announce to the world that you're doing something illegal. Namely, the 212 numbers, which are the old Manhattan, or used to be New York and Manhattan area code, are sufficiently valuable. You can't really read that. Well, you can buy a 212 number for $75 to more than $1,000 if you want to feel like you've always been a Manhattanite. In that, people claim that if you have a 212 number, your phone calls get answered more readily. And so numbers are valuable, and there is indeed, and this is distinctly not an endorsement, is a website where you can indeed bid for a 212 number. I don't know if that's the only area code that that's the case, but clearly there still is some residual value just as a indicator of where you were born or whatever. I've always said that your cell phone number is basically a good indicator where you were when which area you lived in when you were a teenager. So, next. So, because some of the mailing list discussion has generated a fair amount of related issues, let me just talk about a few of those. So, the old model that we had for telephone number assignment in general was we created a policy, we being generally regulators of various sort, public organization of various sort, and then there was a long and drawn-out process to create a set of operations and databases and organizations that managed that particular policy. So it was very much a policy first, mechanism later. That worked somewhat, but what it has led to is that you have a proliferation of mechanisms that are relatively hard to evolve and that don't adapt well to policy changes, simply because they're so tied to one particular model of doing things. So one example of that is we came up with number portability in an era where internet really wasn't a major factor for consumers. So number porting meant that you could switch long distance providers, even though that's really not the major use of a number portability database at the moment, but the original motivation was you should be able to switch landline providers, long distance landline providers in that. That was before really cell portability was an issue and so on. And the notion was that you would have a validation system in place by a recorded voice message that would confirm that you indeed intended to switch from long-distance carrier A to long-distance carrier B. That made some sense when people used essentially only the phone to interact with phone service as opposed to going to websites to change their parameters. Now, that mechanism, as a company that tried to do differently found out, is has its security flaw, or tried to exploit, let's put it that way. Namely, they created fake recordings recently to indicate that somebody had switched long-distance carrier to them. That didn't work out too well in the end, but for the company at least. So, but the mechanism was set at a time when the mechanisms that you had in place were very much what you could do with the existing system. They don't adapt very well to new circumstances, so porting is still somewhat awkward and slow and error-prone and all of that, not so much because of the databases, but because of all the processes that are around that. So kind of what my hope is that we get to is to have a generic platform that makes it much easier to change policies relatively quickly and relatively easily. We have a notion that technology is relatively fungible and that policy takes forever to change. I don't think that's naturally true. You can change policy within a year or so, if you go through the right processes. That's not too hard. It takes a lot of work, but you can do that. As we know here in the IETF, getting from an internet draft 00 to RFC in a year would be a miracle. And so it's probably a lot easier timescale-wise to change policy, particularly make relatively minor adjustments. What has held it back in many cases is the unavailability of technology because it's so anchored to the old policy. The other piece that we have is that in the current world, we have several different number spaces that are similar in many ways, in the sense that they're assigned in various ways to various entities. They're used over long time periods. They're scarce and valuable in the sense you can't just hand them out to anybody who asks in whatever number you want. But they're treated very differently. And that's particularly the 800 numbers and related toll-free numbers in general, and non-toll-free numbers, so the usual area code type of numbers. But there are also SMS short codes, and there's a bunch of other smaller namespaces as well. So they all have a model, variations on a model, where there is a set of entities, carriers, Westborgs, you name it, that can get numbers. They're entities that then interact with those requesters. There's a database that keeps track of it. And there's a set of rules and policies what happens when you transfer those identifiers between entities, as to how soon that can happen once an identifier is returned to the available pool. All of those are policies that are implemented individually. And that often leads to rather strange behavior simply because we have a very different issues in the 800 number space versus non-800 number space, for example, where we've had concerns about hoarding in the 800 number space. But on the other hand, we've had the ability to do non-geographic assignment by its very nature. All of these type of things are different, and they're really not different because anybody thought it was a good idea. It just kind of evolved that way. And the technology is very different. We have an SMS 800 database, which has nothing to do with text messages. It's just system management service or whatever it's called. And we have a very different numbering system in the US, for example. And similar divergences exist, I suspect, elsewhere. So we all want, sorry, one more. We all want the usual good things, which needs to be scalable, reliable, trustworthy, neutral, all of these type of good things that I suspect none of us will disagree with. Next one. So what I won't talk about here, and I hope we can avoid that discussion, is any short-term changes to numbering administration itself. We're not doing a short-term type thing here. This is not something we're trying to implement next year or next month. A, we won't get it done anyway, and B, that will, I believe, just constrain us from thinking a little bit beyond just tweaking a parameter on some XML SOA type of thing in that. I don't think we need to assume or even discuss the notion that there will be kind of a global root of some sort that manages it all, and we can argue as to whether that should be our favorite or not so favorite organization, whether ICANN or ITU or, I don't know, whatever other organization, but Knights Templars or whoever else you want to sign for that. So the idea is generally that policy as to who makes decisions should remain wherever it is. That's somebody else's problem. In some cases, it's transnational, say for +1. In some cases, in most cases, it's national. But in some cases, there may be special number spaces that are not really national. So there are some numbers, for example, as satellite phone numbers that have a country code that isn't really national in that sense. So they should keep doing what they're doing. But it doesn't mean that the mechanisms that they can avail themselves of shouldn't be the same or at least have a large amount of commonality. So I think of this as that we have a common set of core protocols and then a set of profiles and business rules and other more special purpose designations probably made by local regulators, probably made by local standards organizations that are more nationally specific, that then instantiate a workable system for their national or other needs in that. And there's no need to even have a global coordination with that because we don't do that today, and number assignment, generally speaking, is national in the sense that you typically cannot get national numbers outside that range. And if some country wants to make numbers available more broadly, they can do that, but there's no requirement for that. We don't want to change any numbering policies that are currently being done. It may well lead to new opportunities for changing it. So for example, I believe that if we do our job right, we can make it much easier, much more difficult for people to spoof numbers, and we can make it much easier for people to port numbers in much more universal ways than they can do today. There's all kinds of strange restrictions on number porting, for example, today that make no sense at all to an average consumer because they have no idea what a rate center is and why they should care about it. So we also don't need to discuss who is the recipient or the actor on any of these protocol interactions. That could be carriers, that could be organizations that are not quite carriers but provide telecommunication-like services. So for example, again, the US classification is interconnected VoIP providers, so these are the UMAs and Vonages of the world, provide interconnected services to the classical PSTN. And as those of you who've been following numbering policies closely, there has been a trial in the US where a set of these interconnected VoIP providers were given direct access to telephone numbers as opposed to indirect access. Has not led to a rule change at the moment, but it indicates that at least people are thinking about broadening the set of entities who can receive, be the recipient of numbers.
Yes, Henning, John Peterson. I just want to make sure, again, because I talk about this in my presentation next. I mean, we're not talking about changing numbering policies in the sense the IETF has no power or interest in changing numbering policies, but we are going to talk about architectures that support exactly what you were just describing, right? Cases where maybe there are like a VoIP provider or something who should get direct access to these numbering resources. So when you say we're not, out of scope for your discussion is who can get numbers, is it really, or are we going to be looking at tools that have applicability, at least, to policies?
And again, as far as I can tell, none of the discussion, more detailed discussion, preclude any entity that is otherwise qualified, in the sense that can get the credentials and all of that, to participate as a protocol entity. And we should, I think this is just good design, not assume that the number of entities that are doing that today is the same as there will be going forward. I mean, if it's smaller, it might be smaller in some cases because there's a fair amount of intermediation and kind of intermediate entities that are going on. Carriers, I mean, we have about 4,000 carriers, I think, in the US. Most of them never interact with the numbering system directly, even though they theoretically would be entitled to. They interact through intermediaries of various sort. Or it could be much larger. It could potentially be, in some countries, for example, it might be more on the scale of large businesses, for example, or individuals. So.
I mean, again, the only reason why I beg this question is because the tools we can design, right? If we accept the constraint that only the entities that can get numbers today are what we're going to build tools for, we would be building different tools than if we were at least within. So that is in scope of this, is my understanding.
So I don't assume that everybody has to speak TCAP, for example.
Okay, Martin Dolly. I'm just curious to a couple of statements. One, some of the statements that were made on the list with regard to tools, and now we're talking tools and policy. I guess here's the thing. We're going to design tools not understanding what they're going to build. I'm sort of at a loss because we're going to design, I mean, if I'm going to build something, I know what tools to pick out of my workbench to put into the box before I go build this thing. And so there has to be some direction with policy. You just can't develop tools independent of policy.
Sure. I mean, we clearly have to have some spectrum of policies that are plausible. But my sense is that, for example, for the who part, that has relatively little effect on the how and the what part. In a sense, only to the extent that it changes the number of entities you have to manage. So if you assumed you only have 10 entities, and so handing out keys and other materials by fax is a perfectly, or FedEx is a perfectly reasonable management mechanism, we should probably get the notion that the number might be too large to do things in manual ways. That's probably my only real kind of tweak. I will get to, I don't think the number and who matters all that much, because again, there will be different countries will have very different scales. But what matters is that you have, where I think it gets hairier is when I talk about porting, because there is a set of things that we should talk about that are probably somewhat more, what are possible kind of models of policy that might be reasonable to suppose, and it might be impossible to have something which does everything that anybody could ever possibly imagine, at least without making a protocol extensions. And John.
Right. Yeah, I was just saying, so in my talk, we do go into this kind of tools and their applicability to existing and potential future numbering policies and so on. So I'd suggest we defer that because I really do go through kind of a whole bunch of use cases in my slides.
Okay. So,
one more.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, John Levine, I'll try to be quick. Outside of the U.S., numbers and charges are deeply intertwined in ways that they aren't like here. Like in the U.S., numbers are basically either local toll or toll free. You know, and the fact that there are numbers that look like American numbers but actually ring in the Caribbean and cost you 83 cents is, most people consider that to be a bug. Whereas in Europe, like mobile numbers are different from landline numbers, and typically each mobile carrier sets a different rate. You know, and in the UK, everybody knows that calls to 3 cost extra, so they hate people with 3 numbers. So, you know, I would love it if the charges would all go away and it's all caller paid and don't bother me. But I don't see that happening, you know, and so as I'm sure as you know perfectly well, it offers phenomenal possibilities for fraud. You know, call this number for hot chat, and you know, so I don't see this in the list of things to be concerned about, and I don't see how we can get away from it.
Well, again, I'm not. Maybe it's at the abstract level. There are 2 separate issues, namely who can get what numbers. For what purpose? I mean, 3 things, I suppose. Yeah. Okay, that's a policy decision which is outside, is done by people that are generally not sitting in this room. And however, I don't see, and maybe we should discuss it in a more concrete way as opposed to an abstract way, is the protocol mechanisms and data elements that you put in don't seem to strongly depend on the fact that, say, only mobile phones can get certain prefixes in certain countries. That is enforced by the allocator that makes sure that unless you have a mobile phone, you won't get that particular prefix. And that policy, just like we do for access control policy on HTTP, we don't specify those, but we have a mechanism in place which allows you to have a digest and basic and whatever else authentication which can be used by these type of policies. That's the same basic idea. Again, I'm not advocating that we get rid of distinctions. There will always be numbers, for example, that aren't assignable. That's just, even in the US. The one argument that I would make is, namely currently we have a very crude mechanism of labeling charges and other things by number. And we've seen, however, in the US porting between mobile and landline, that we have separated the 2. Namely, we still keep track of, in the database, in the NPAC, whether a number is a mobile or landline number because it matters for regulatory compliance, namely as to what kind of robocalls are legal to one or the other, because there's a difference between the 2. So there's a flag now in the database, as opposed to a number distinguisher, which says this number, even though it looks exactly like the landline number next to it, is actually a mobile number. So that's a policy, that's a technology tweak where you now can use that to get yourself flexibility that you wouldn't have if you rely on the number and overload it essentially with other functions. I'm not advocating that. We don't have to change. Nothing has to change. If people don't want to change it, I don't see why any of that, what I'm going to talk about, depends on changing it. It needs to support these existing mechanisms, but it shouldn't feel constrained that it can only support those mechanisms.
We can argue with great length, but not here.
Okay.
So just as a practical matter, we're a little less than a quarter way through your presentation and a little more than halfway through your time slot.
Okay.
So if you
Now
want
I'll try to
avoid some of the
accelerate.
important things.
Okay. So number allocation can differ between numbers, and again, my contention is I'd like for people who claim otherwise to show more concretely why it matters as opposed to just in scale. Next. Numbering generally, and I won't go through any of these entities in detail, in the US, and I suspect the US is the most complicated in that bunch. I think most other countries have solved that problem somewhat more easily and simply, but because of historical reasons, there's any number of entities, from the regulator, the FCC on the right, to the North American Numbering Council with its various working groups, and then various operational units that actually manage the databases that actually interact on the numbering side. And so clearly they will get involved along the way, but they are well aware, I'm talking regulatory to Nancy, so in particular the North American Numbering Council, they're well aware that this is going on, but we clearly, there are liaison type of issues, informational issues that we need to take care of, others as well. So we have a number of opportunities to reconsider just simply because we had to do that just because of the old model, that we had a set of assumptions that we may not need to transfer into the IP environment. So, for example, we have local number portability, North American Number Plan Administrator, the Pool Administrator, the LERG, RESPARGs. These evolved, they may continue, but they evolved largely for historical reasons, and they're now pretty difficult to merge because they all have their own technology. In an all IP environment, there's at least an opportunity, again, that then policymakers can avail themselves of or not, to simplify the system, make it easier to understand, cheaper, all of that type of stuff. We also then have problems, and on a different mailing list, we have discussed those in particular for CNAM space, that because of deficiencies, one could argue, in the existing model of associating metadata with calls, namely call a name, we have a set of databases, the CNAM databases, where some are performing a useful function honestly and with diligence, and others not so much. Next. So again, the policy variables that are outside of our discussion as to what we think about those are dinner discussions, but they're not really relevant to the technical discussion here, namely who can get what numbers, what rights do number holders, and unless I misspeak, I never talk about number owners, so holders that have a current title, if you want to call it that, to that number. Those are issues outside of concern. In what units are they allocated, in onesies or in 1,000 blocks or something larger than that? Are numbers restricted in some ways? Who pays for numbers? Are they just handed out for nominal fee, or are they more like domain names where you pay $10 a year? All outside our concern. And what attributes are associated with a number, such as the model, such as is it landline versus wireless? They will vary and they will change, but what the instantiation is, we need to be aware of the range, but we don't need to pick among those. Next. So who are the actors? And we still haven't converged, I suspect, on terminology, but we'll need to do that eventually. But the basic notion is there's a set of entities that might provide some kind of service. There's a number of entities whose role is only managing numbers. Whether they also do other things is a separate issue, but their role in the protocol is managing numbers. That's what they do in that protocol role. There might also be third-party verifiers that play a role, and those are in particular relevant for porting. So these don't manage numbers, but they're part of a protocol flow because they basically need to say, yep, this porting operation is okay, I have validated it, so they get looped in even though they don't really assign numbers or do anything else. Then there might be property validators, namely entities that actually assert, based on information that they have available, that a numbering holder has a certain property, is at a certain address, is a certain type of business, etc. And then there's other consumers, regulators, and possibly others. Next. So there are some additional numbering uses. So as I mentioned earlier, we already use one of the numbering databases to deal with robocalling legal restrictions. But we also may use it for providing additional validation functions for entities that are registered, so that it is much more difficult, for example, for a non-bank to claim that they're a financial institution. There's a history of that. For example, in some of the databases, at least in the US, certain numbers, namely hotel numbers and prison phones, have a label. And these particular ones have emerged for particular reasons. This has to do with collect calling, and obviously prison phones, as you do want to know if an inmate is calling you from a penitentiary in that. So we have a kind of very basic tradition of doing something like that, but we can do more than that, particularly as said, to deal with spoofing and impersonation. Next. So I see, if I were to use the closest analogy, and again, analogy is always bad, that you have a title registry essentially that we are building. And we're registering a set of titles to numbering resources in this particular case. So the goal is to create a clear record of number use, who has it, and the history of that number use. That's often important for a number of reasons when there are conflicts and disputes and all of that. And we want to associate attributes with those numbers. Some are private, some are semi-public, some may even be public. Next. Semi-public means they're available to a restricted set of entities like carriers, other numbering administrators, or law enforcement, or whatever. So the big picture of what I kind of see as a model, you have some service providers, and again, this doesn't mean that they are what we think of as service providers today. I just couldn't come up with a better name. Some entity that interacts with that have a right to add, modify, and delete entries. And then there's a mother of all databases in there, which has a key of a number and a bunch of attributes. But then there are interfaces using these orange protocols that are either query or kind of pub/sub push type of things. And those themselves may expose part of that through existing legacy or new interfaces that are made available to different constituencies. So it could be made available through enum. That's the way it works today. There's a database, say the NPAC, and there's an enum type interface provided either by that database provider or by third parties. The TCAP for legacy use, SS7 use. There might be standardized APIs, proprietary APIs. So I imagine that there are going to be lots of entities that are going to provide APIs and protocol interfaces, both to address specific needs. So one that is today in use is, and this is again North American, is there's a special interface for law enforcement to figure out who owns what number at the moment, which carrier in this particular case, so they can serve the carrier with a warrant if they want to intercept calls to that number. And so that's a special interface that's designed only for that constituency, but it's essentially a simple query interface. Number in, a bunch of data goes out. And you need a history. Next. We also, and this is just an example, need to worry about that numbers, just like domain names do different states, but same basic idea, they have different states that they are in and they matter. In a sense, what you can do with a number depends on what state it is in. So for example, if it's a spare number that you can use, then you can transition it to a working number, then it might eventually expire so that it's no longer in use, but it can't be reallocated at the moment until some time period elapses. This is a typical one. If you move and abandon your phone number, you don't want that phone number immediately to be assigned again to somebody, because they would get lots of calls that are not relevant to that person. Privacy violations would occur and all of that type of stuff. So you typically don't do that. So there needs to be a mechanism in place to encode that this number has particular use and allocation restrictions and when they expire and all of that. Yes, please.
Martin Dolly, I mean, I think there's another category, subcategory, like dirty numbers, so to speak. So numbers that have been identified for spoofing sources that have been more or less quarantined in a pool of dirty numbers.
Right, and it could be, that's probably subcategory of a reserve type of thing, in the sense that they are restricted from allocation. Okay, and both the 800 numbers and domain names have versions of that. And one of the things that I hope that the expertise assembled in the room will do is provide us with kind of the type of things that happen. My general sense is that we wouldn't create a list itself. We would provide a way to label things, and the meaning of the labels is then used by the protocol mechanisms and the instances to do something or not do something with that, as opposed to us necessarily defining what they all mean. Next. Again, because this has come up, is there are lots of countries out there. We don't want to solve the problem of having a global root type of thing. We don't need to have the F root here or worry about an ICANN-like thing as to who can put things in the root database. I don't think that's necessary. Next. And that's simply because the number of country codes, while not small, is relatively modest. If I counted right, there are about 230 country codes, take or leave a few, that are in use. And they don't change all that much. The numbering administrators that are used for those are not changing constantly. So even if somebody has to maintain a static table, a service provider would emerge that would simply keep track of that for you and provide a database that's current. I don't see that as a problem that's worth solving, simply because A, it's difficult to solve, and B, it's not clear that it buys as much compared to just doing it semi-manually, simply because it doesn't change all that often. Next. So then there are two architectures that I think are relevant. And there may be others, but I posit those two to start with. Namely, one is something which looks pretty similar to the domain name model for each TLD. Namely, one is one where you have a registry, which is kind of a title registry, which has the canonical record of what identifiers have been assigned to whom. And then there are user-facing or service provider-facing entities that are more that are competing with each other for customers, and they have their privilege in a sense. They are given rights to modify the records in the master database, so it's not just any random entity. So you have to go through a set of qualification steps, but it's a much larger number. In the domain name case, it's probably hundreds that actually have the ability to interact with that master database, and they have a consumer-facing, consumer identifiers, whoever that may be, facing role as well. The second model, which I think is more technically interesting, but also significantly more challenging, is one where you have not a master registry type of thing, a single logical entity, but you have multiple of those. And we've seen in both the numbering administration and in domain names that there are possibly some logistical advantages to that. Just about in a half an hour or so, in case you're bored with modern, you can tune into the FCC commission meeting. There will be discussion of a possible change in numbering administrators. Needless to say, and I will leave it at that, that was not a particularly, let's say that will make most divorces look like a personally pleasant stroll in the park. So it certainly has benefited Washington area newspapers with various full-page ads, but this was not a painless process. And choosing as to who gets to be the mother of all databases. The second one, we know an ICANN model that being the registry leads to questions as to who gets the money and who gets to do it, what happens if somebody goes rogue or doesn't do a good job, all of those issues. So I think there's at least an advantage to thinking of a model that is more distributed, where you have trusted entities that have a uniform and identical view within a few seconds of each other. Now, obviously, it can never be complete speed of light and all of that, but logically identical view. They can all perform the same operations. It doesn't matter who initiates it. It ends up, the logical database states ends up being exactly the same. And indeed, we're starting to be looking at these models even within the IETF context, namely the TV white spaces database is one example where that's being attempted. There are about a dozen or so entities that either are or want to operate a database, or they have to go through the qualification step. But they're all, I can ask any one of the databases, and I should ideally, doesn't always work out that way, but ideally I should get exactly the same answer back, and I can interact with whatever database offers the best service, the best price, with the interface protocols that I need, whatever it happens to be.
Henning, we've actually reached the end of your slot. John has agreed to cede up to 15 minutes of his, but
Okay.
if we can skip to highlights of the presentation, I think that would be beneficial.
I will do that.
Thanks.
Okay, next. So how do we, now we get to the technical meat. So the three problems that we need to solve is how do we distribute changes in the database? Kind of gossiping protocols will do that for you. We've experienced with that in LAST. An interesting one is how do we allocate new numbers to avoid collisions. I don't want to have a chance if there's a 212 number pops up that everybody grabs it and two databases disagree as to who ended up with it. We know how to do that. There are two possibilities that probably are at least worth investigating, and possibly others, namely a blockchain model, kind of Bitcoin style, and the second one is a set of distributed systems protocols that are generally known as the Paxos variants, very well established, provably correct set of protocols. And we need a mechanism to recover if a replica, if one of those registries is disconnected temporarily, it needs to catch up so that it has the same data. Next. I won't go through that. If you have these distributed systems, there's a set of provably correct algorithms that it will ensure that even when things fail, messages get lost, or processors, meaning entities, fail temporarily or unreachable, that nothing bad happens. You will never get an inconsistent state. These are well established in the database and related communities. Next. So you ensure non-triviality, that really something happens, safety, and liveness. Next. We need to decide, which probably is relatively easy, namely, do we have a single number for each record, a single record for each number? Do we have split records? We obviously want to have the ability to have range records as well, and indirections, all that. Next. As an example, we will probably find that we'll need a set of metadata elements in that, but what those are should be, in my view, relatively flexible. There's probably going to be a key, E164 number. There's probably an entity that currently has access to that number. In the US, that will be an OCN, but it may be some other identifier elsewhere, and a few other things that you could possibly put in there. Next. As an example of a database content, which is simply copied off a web page, is an example of the kind of information that is a numbering database contains. Not saying that all of that should be there, but that's an example of the kind of metadata that I'm talking about. You could have the stir type of keys. I won't discuss that here. That will be subject of the afternoon discussion. Next. We will have a notion to discuss as to, is there a geographic distinction? Namely, if I ask based on different locations, will I get different answers? Or for 800 numbers, for example, it is possible to reallocate the same number, although that seems rarely used, but it is available, that I can have regional 800 numbers. So I can have a number that only, I don't know how big the region is, if it's a state or something. I can have an 800 number only in Texas, and somebody else can have the very same 800 number in New Jersey, and that will work. That clearly matters because suddenly the primary key is no longer just the number. It is the Texas 800 version or the New Jersey 800 version of that same number. So the primary key changes. Next. One model is that we have some kind of a set of core elements, then allow the usual IANA registration for widely used elements that either the IETF or adders or other bodies, similar situated bodies, would define, and then possibly private extensions as well for things that are relevant only to some narrow community. Next. This is obviously closely related to who is information. So just, I think yesterday, RDAP got published, at least bits and pieces of it. So one of the questions I think the group will have to deal with is it sufficiently similar that we can just do an RDAP extension to retrieve information out of a database? They don't deal with inserting data or all the other pieces, but the retrieval piece seems pretty close. Next. We have to worry about as to what the authentication model is. Namely, is it based on OCN or some other, the identity of the user? I'm just using that as a placeholder, could be anything. And so is it enforced, because all the registries have to enforce that if there are several, as to that only the current holder can modify that? That works for almost everything, except it doesn't work for the number porting, because that's when you change the holder of that number. Next. You had a question?
If we can keep it very brief. Thanks.
Alex Mayover, former chair of the Drinks Working Group. I would wish to note, since you mentioned RDAP, that Drinks also produced a protocol that is about the provisioning of phone numbers and related entities. So the group might also look at that and
certainly
check whether it's feasible for that.
Okay. Send it to the list. They would be, I mean, that's part of a data gathering phase. I won't go through this in detail. I will just point out really that one porting of records is probably the most messy part of it, because it's the most steps involved in actually making the transition, and there's the most possibility for things to go wrong, either be inconsistent or end up in a bad state somehow. And several porting models have evolved. In general, there's a token-based model, which is similar to what we use for domain names, where you get a token and you can change registrars. We could use something like that for telephone numbers, which might actually work better than the current model. Next. You can have a user-initiated model where if the user owns the number, holds the number, that problem becomes somewhat easier. Then the only problem assumes when you transfer the number between users, so it doesn't make the problem go away, just a different one. Next. And you can potentially have a confirmation-based model where this is the new and the old service provider need to interact with each other. The old one needs to agree or at least be involved in some way when that transfer happens. Again, that can be done in a variety of ways. The third-party validator could be involved. So there's a possibility for essentially having a loop of an additional external step involved that the registry would enforce. Next. Let's get that. We have that. Talked about that. Caching, we obviously want to allow the ability to cache data in a sensible way. So then probably if we can do cache validation type of mechanism so that it's clear that you always get the current data, because a number of databases typically don't change a whole lot. They are pretty static, so caching works very well, but you do want to make sure that there's no updated data. So traditional cache expiration mechanisms don't work very well, because it's very hard to predict when a number will change, and you don't want to have the cache lifetime be a minute, because the average lifetime of a record may well be months or years, but you don't want to wait a month before the change propagates. So caching needs to be considered. Next. I suspect we'll discuss at some point as to what the basic underlying protocol is. Is it going to be some JSON XML of HTTPS REST style or something completely different? Do we need a pub-sub mechanism, or is it truly a query and HTTP post, DEL, and so on mechanism as well? I suspect we'll need some kind of a subscription mechanism, for example, in some cases. Next, there's a number of open issues that we'll need to discuss. Namely, which architectures do we need support? If we only have a tree, it's less complex. We don't need the synchronization primitives. We lose maybe capabilities. What are the state transitions? Can we abstract those so that new states can be added? And that's an implementation issue at a higher layer, if you like, of the protocol. What is the data model? Is it JSON? Is it Yang? And who knows? What protocols do we learn from? in terms of experience. EPP, ENAM, RDAP, Yang, the Sprint protocol, whatever it happens to be, we need to figure out what are kind of things that we may not use but may teach us lessons. I've already reached out to some of the EPP folks to get some of their input, and have gotten some feedback, and so on. I will, and then we read queries and update queries. And I think that's it.
So, Keith Drage, just a question. Does your proposed database expose or hide the individual numbers in block number range allocations for direct dialing in or direct inward dialing, whatever you want to call it?
I'm not sure I caught
If you allocate 100 numbers for DDI, do you have one entry in your table or 100?
So that's, well,
Actually, if I could ask us, if we have a question that has bearing on the charter, go ahead and wait for the charter discussion. If we don't, please send it on the modern mailing list. We are over time for the presentation.
And I mean, we're not going to get that level of implementation specificity at this point, Keith, right? I mean, I think we need to up-level a bit and talk about what we think the interesting flows are, the use cases, and then we can worry about exactly how we're going to implement this.
Okay. Any other sufficiently high-level questions that the chair will want to comment before they yank me off the stage here?
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hi. This thing working? Good. I'm John. I'm going to be talking about two things today. One is Draft Peterson Modern Problems, a submission that emerged at the last minute at great expense that Tom McGarry and I hacked together because no one else had really put something like this forward. I actually observed after I released this, I was like Googling for the draft to like find my own work, and I learned this a 1981 Chevy Chase film called Modern Problems. Apparently, in this film, Chevy Chase develops telekinetic powers and hilarity and hijinks ensues. Just wanted to be clear up front, my presentation today will not be about that Chevy Chase film. Next slide, please. Looking around this room, I see a lot of familiar faces, some people that aren't always here at the IETF anymore. And it takes me back, and I think, how long have we really been working on this stuff here? I mean, it's getting on to like 20 years that we've had this amazing long-term goal to migrate telephone routing and directory services to the internet. We've had some great successes. Other parts, maybe not so much. But one component of that we never would have guessed at the start was the telephone numbers have not gone away. I mean, I remember discussions we had in the late 90s. We thought, oh, SIP Greenfield identifier is going to take this over. Things will look just like email identifiers. But here we are in 2015. And partly it's mobility that has sustained this relevance. The fact that now we all have these general purpose computers in our pockets and they have telephone numbers associated with them, applications still leverage them. And it's become a big part of how that mobile ecosystem works. But it is also, as Henning went through in his presentation, it's that they're non-linguistic, they're international, they're opaque. They have like all these other properties that probably we'd need some kind of identifier that actually does these things. Andrew, do you have a point already?
Well, there's also legacy, right? The
Yeah,
problem,
sure.
the problem
do
is
want
that you
to-
need telephone numbers in order to work with all the legacy equipment out there. So you can't just change the world in 1 week.
I'd suggest, though, that even if we didn't need to interwork in that fashion between voice over IP networks and even for texting and things like that, right? I think we'd still use them for these reasons. But really, they've eluded the Internet's grasp. We've never really known how to deal with telephone numbers. We've had some ideas which have been successful to varying degrees. We'll talk about that a bit. But it's still anchored in the PSTN. Next slide, please. So let's do a what if. They're anchored in the PSTN, but what if we just pretended they weren't for a day? What if we pretended telephone numbers were just like internet identifiers? What if you could get numbers the same way that you can get domain names? Or what if you could just get numbers like you get IP addresses? And this was a subject, basically, of a workshop that was held at the FCC last year. Show of hands, how many people in this room attended that workshop? Okay, that's pretty good. And this workshop was informed by the fact that we have this accelerating PSTN transition. We're being informed by a lot of carriers that they want to cut their ties effectively with the SS7 network. And we're going to need some new infrastructure, some new tricks to deal with that. And so the theory behind this workshop was, let's just like blue sky this and think, well, what if we do away with some of our traditional assumptions? Where would we get? What could we test? What kind of models could we experiment with if we just like did away with that entirely? And it's a complicated question because we look at how you get internet identifiers, how you get domain names, how you get IP addresses. There's more than one way to do it. There's complex systems for this, and you can get a domain name like bundled in from something you get from Google today. When I bought a little home camera, Foscam, for my house, thing's got a DNS name burned into it, right? There's all kinds of things you do today you just kind of get domain names as a side effect of. And with IP addresses, some people need to buy big blocks. Some people are just getting them dynamically via DHCP. There's a great deal of diversity that could inspire us. And when we look at the use cases we want to satisfy for this, we have a lot of opportunities to draw on what the expertise has been. Olaf, did you have a question? Oh, he's just bullshitting. Next slide, please. And the second component of that is it's not just what if, right? You can go to something like Google Voice today and go to a web page and get a phone number. You can search their database and choose a number that has an area code or a zip code that you like, and you've got that number like that. I've done this a couple times for a couple different small businesses. So people are already pushing that administrative model. We're already seeing people doing this out there. And the question is, what would it be like if we took those models and actually applied them to some more traditional telephony registration models and number allocation models as this PSTN to IP transition takes place? Next slide. All right, I want to get through this material and give people an opportunity to get up to the mic on this slide in particular to just clear the air, the elephant in the room about this, right? There's been some confusion about this on the list. The IETF is not going to set number policy anywhere. We don't want it. Like if you're here from like study group 2, we do not want to eat your lunch, man. We really don't. Keep your E164 plan. We're going to be talking about roots and authorities, but we're going to be talking about them in a very specific and narrow sense that we'll explain in the slides going forward. But we got to acknowledge, number policy, it's a sensitive topic. I mean, this is a scarce inventory. It's managed by regulators in a very, very specific manner that we don't want to fudge here. And it's also a polarizing topic. I understand perfectly well. There are some participants that are in this room today who feel that architectures that are in place would be threatened by opening this number allocation model up, right? And by potentially having entities that are not traditional entities get them, or changing the way that you can get your hands on a telephone number. And I also understand there are other people who feel that architectures they want to instantiate are today threatened by the current restrictions on number allocation. But I wanted to create a time where if people want to talk about this, they can talk about it, but with the following proviso on the bottom in mind. This is not our decision. Today, what we're talking about here during this BOP is not a referendum on what any policy should be. It's not in our scope. We can't affect it. But if people think this is material to whether we should do this or not as an effort in the IETF, I'd like to talk about that now so we can get it out of the way. But if people are willing to say, okay, yeah, we understand it's polarizing, we understand that there are these caveats to it, but we all agree, these tools are going to be useful regardless of what the policies are, or it's not worth doing them. That was the fundamental principle behind this experiment. We want to solve for what we think is a set of interesting or likely policies. We're not here to champion any specific policy. Would anyone like to talk about that before I proceed?
Yeah, so Eric Berger is just an experiential thing, which is if we do things that the policies say can't be done, then we will produce a very nice protocol that nobody uses. On the other hand, I think of our experience at Georgetown where we've got a system for catching child pornographers. Over 4,000 arrests, over 200 children rescued. And how did we do it? Because everything we kept saying, oh, can we do this? The FBI and the state police kept saying, oh, you can't do that. There's the Fourth Amendment. And finally we said, well, what are the policies? What can we do? And then informed by the policies, we could come up with something that is proven effective. And that's really what my concern was that I voiced on the list, is that if we do stuff in vacuum, not considering policies, we might do a lot of work that no one uses. Or if we can get informed by policies, then we could do something that a lot of people hopefully could use.
Well, and obviously we're looking to the community, right? to regulators, to carriers, to the people who tell the North American Numbering Plate Administrator, say, what to do, to figure out what they want to do here. And again, so if that's the level of this, and we're all cool with this, we all understand it's sensitive, we all understand it's polarizing, we can move on. Oh, we cannot yet move on. Mr. Shockey.
Richard Shockey, if we waited for the North American Numbering Council to actually provide us with policy input, we would all be dead before.
Understood. Very good. Okay, proceed, please. All right, so the Modern Problems document, with its Chevy Chase-isms, really is just talking about three moving parts: creating some kind of an acquisition mechanism, some kind of a provisioning mechanism, and some kind of a query mechanism. And we can say the first is, how do I request and receive numbers on the internet over pure IP? The second is, how do I provision that number with the CSP? Okay, I've acquired a number. Now I want there to be some communication service provider that is going to make that number routable in the sense that calls to that number will reach me. And the third is the query mechanism. How do I get information about a number, including that routing information? Now, these are rough scope, high-level things. We have much more detail about what these are, but those are my sound bites for what these three mechanisms will do. Yes, Richard.
Rich Shockey, in terms of how do I request and receive numbers, I would actually add how do I add or delete metadata associated with the number as well.
I think that most of that will end up being in provisioning, but we'll talk about it. There are some gray areas.
How you want to deal with metadata, I think, needs to be fleshed
We'll
out.
talk about that a bit. And there is RDAP and other things that I want to talk about in the slides going forward. But one thing to make clear about this, I doubt there's going to be much by way of new protocol design. We're going to be building data models and information models that are going to be using well-known industry favorite techniques for moving information between servers. Right. Henning? We're not going to invent a new transport for this stuff.
No, I mean, certainly I don't think we're trying to do anything except application layer type protocols here. I would challenge a little bit the notion we don't need to do any protocol work at all. Namely, as I tried to point out, besides the query and update type of client-initiated functionality that we'll have, it seems pretty clear that we need kind of quote server-initiated functions as well for kind of pub-sub type of things, because the existing model, as you're well familiar with, has a very strong, even though it doesn't use IETF terminology, it very much has a notion that updates are distributed widely and on demand, so to say, the other way, from the database to the entity that is a customer of that database in some sense. And secondly, more interestingly, as I pointed out, if we want an interoperable protocol between multiple registries, there is the synchronization primitive, which is completely independent of whether you store metadata, whether you store telephone numbers or license plates in that. That needs to work and be implemented correctly, because otherwise we don't have a complete protocol. And I would argue the experience of the TV white spaces database, which did not do that. If you read the Ars Technica article recently on that particular one, where besides being a data quality problem, they also had synchronization problems. And I think partially it's been because there really hasn't been a terribly good mechanism to do that. So with that little asterisk, I would say we may end up doing a little bit of protocol work, but we're certainly not going to do HTTP variants or anything like that.
I mean, Turk has, as you know, a bunch of encoding-ish stuff in it, and so the bindings to different transports and bindings to different encoding formats to the data. So I certainly imagine it's going to be that kind of bit pushing. And yes, there may be some specific architectural models like that where we're going to be selecting some transport and saying that's the standard we're going to use for that. But you're not imagining we're going to design new features for HTTP. That's what I'm trying to say here when we say no new protocol designs. Yes, Mr. Crocker.
So this is Dave Crocker, and in spite of what you and Henning just exchanged, I'm very confused by the bottom. And since you've worked on this space for a long time, taking a look at the list above, and I don't care whether this is what's finally chosen, but you put thought into putting this slide together in the assertion at the bottom. What do we have that is deployed and working at scale that comes anywhere near handling that set of functionality in the protocol sets today?
So I'm going to actually go through each of these in detail with use cases and talk about where I think the protocols fit into this. I mean, I could...
Just a quick list of what you think is currently deployed that would satisfy it, because it's a very strong statement at the bottom and it sets a stage.
Okay, I mean, if that's... I agree that that statement is perhaps overly strong to Henning's correction, but yes, I think a lot of this is going to be HTTP based.
So HTTP doesn't do any of those things. HTTP is an exchange protocol.
Yes.
That's why I was asking about that list, because that's the semantic list.
Right. I think that HTTP's being able to make requests and get responses actually does satisfy a lot of the needs that are described on this slide.
Except for I think we're about to get to a semantic argument about what protocol means here.
We're also not going to design the protocol today. Dave, we're trying to figure out the scope of the work. I've got a bunch of really high-level use cases. If you think we need all new protocols to do this when we go forward, then great, we'll find them.
Yeah, so I think this is exactly where we just have to be careful that we're distinguishing between defining new four-letter acronyms and on the other side, not defining any semantics in that. So you could argue whether RDAP, for example, is a new protocol. It has a P at the end or not, and I don't think that's particularly productive either way.
Anyway, let's advance, since I know we're a little short on time. So just going through the taxonomy real quick. This is largely drawn from what is in the Modern Problems document today. We have a vague notion of like there's a number authority, which is someone who can distribute blocks of numbers or individual numbers to someone else. It may be that they're already a delegate, like they received a big block from somebody above them, and they're now going to dispense those in smaller blocks to people below them. We use the term root authority. What I mean by root authority anyway is it's just someone who never acquires blocks. There's no one above them for them to get blocks from. It does not assume that they are any particular government agency. For all I know, it is the root authority for an entirely private PBX that is disconnected from everything that is being run on a campus network. The concept here, as we're going to present it, is an abstract concept of someone who merely distributes numbers and can receive numbers, provided they're not a root authority. There is no assumption of a golden root of any kind in this. Then there are number users. These are the people that ultimately are going to get these numbers and assign them to communications resources. There are people who want to run PBXs. There are people who want to run individual phones or individual text messaging systems or whatever. They may themselves act as number authorities for others. For example, if you are an enterprise PBX and you get a few hundred blocks from your upstream telephone provider or your upstream number authority, you will dispense those in turn to clients that register with your PBX. It also includes CSPs, and this is an important distinction. None of these people here that are doing the number authority role or the number user role, which are abstract roles, necessarily actually run a communication service, like a SIP service or something like that. Someone who is a communication service provider may act as an authority for users as well, or they may not. So we're really using CSP in that very broad sense, and Eric and I discussed this a bit on the list of, yeah, I mean pretty much anybody who could like prop up a SIP service is potentially a CSP. Though the majority of people who would do so will probably be more like carriers or perhaps large enterprises. Finally, there are government entities. We're real good when we get through everything. I have one slide about government entities at the end of this presentation, but not much else. So next slide. This is just kind of a review of the delegation of authority for telephone numbers as it exists commonly today. There's a notion that there are root authorities that dispense blocks, for example, 10,000 blocks. They propagate down to carriers, communication service providers, who may in turn then dole out to either enterprises or to individual users. Yes, sir.
Pat Tarpey. John, is there any relationship between this model and the work of STIR?
There is, and that will be the subject of a couple slides coming up.
Okay.
This is really just trying to explain kind of what I think is roughly going on today, which is a trickle-down model, right? Numbers trickle down from some kind of a root authority through communication service providers down to enterprises, sellers, other aggregators like that, and eventually down to clients who end up with an individual number that you can use to place and receive calls. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about the first of these three mechanisms, the acquisition mechanism. Could we go back to that? Actually, I just want to read those. So it manages number inventory, it tracks who get assigns what, and it assigns credentials for things like STIR. Next slide. So if we look at a model that works pretty much like the world does today, I can imagine the need for a protocol, an acquisition mechanism, that would let a client go to an enterprise and get a telephone number. If Cullen has his PBX that is just being deployed somewhere, and a new phone is coming online and it needs a number, I can imagine a protocol for it to go to the call manager and to say, hey, I need a number. I think we should build a tool that supports that use case. If you support that use case, you could also support probably a lot of similar use cases for things like Skype or what have you. At the time the phone goes and makes this request, it'll have to give some information, some identifying information about who the endpoint is going to be assigned to. There will have to be some reason for the person who is receiving this request to believe them. And yes, there are trust model assumptions that are built into this particular use case. But what they'll get in return is both the number and the credential that they ultimately would use to prove to a CSP, for example, that I am eligible to receive calls for that telephone number. People kind of get this. You see how even in roughly the world today, where a protocol like this would fit in?
Actually, I don't.
You don't see a model where Cullen needs to turn up a new phone.
Well, I guess the question is it Cullen turning up a new phone? Is it that it's a Polycom phone talking to a call manager, and so therefore we need an interoperable protocol, or is it Google Talk needing to get a phone number, or Skype getting a Skype out, or something like that?
I can't speak since it's behind you.
So your average large enterprise today has a crapload of different vendors providing PBXs into it that were all acquired at various times, and you're trying to manage a number plan inside of that space, and you've got lots of numbers, and you're trying to allocate them. It might have actually been the PBX that requested up for the 100 phones connected to it. Might have been to the individual phone. That request might be for the local internal dial plan that all starts with 9 or whatever it is. It might be going out to tropoto.com to go get a phone number from them that's a PSTN phone number, which we do today, and we have lots of different interfaces to the zillion different peoples that might be able to provide us a telephone number. It's not a very scalable mechanism, writing it differently to every single person who might be able to provide you that service.
And we have some of the use cases we'll show that show some things.
There's
more
the other
about.
one, which is a fairly common one today, which is all done by just web pages and faxing and all that, is I want an 800 number. In that, there's hundreds of vendors of these numbers, and that could be another.
Let me click forward to the next one, so we'll start to get into this. So if you can do that, I'd also like to have the tool that does that be able to request blocks of numbers, right? Let's say that you're an enterprise, and you have some existing relationship with your upstream service provider, your number authority, and you need a couple hundred more numbers because you're just turning up an entire new PBX within that enterprise for some new location. This should just be able to scale up to that. It should be the same protocol, has basically the same semantics, and should work pretty much the same way. Dolly feels differently about that.
Okay, so Martin Dolly. Making requests for numbers and getting numbers, that's the easy part. It's the part that you kind of glazed over, which is the security policy, how the whole authentication and whether the person should get a number. That's the more difficult part. I mean, which leads to my, okay, so to have a tool where I can request a number and be given a set of numbers, is kind of, okay, so what? The difficult part is, not everybody should get numbers. People should be, or machines or whatever, should be validated on whether they should get the number. I mean, that's the difficult part. I mean, this is...
Well, I understand. I don't mean to gloss over that authorization part. I did say it on the previous slide, though not this one. But I think you have to understand, I imagine when I look at this use case, something more like a service provider, a CSP in this instance, that this is a primary part of their business. Let's say you are a supplier to like a Skype or something, and Skype needs a lot of numbers, and you have an ongoing business relationship with them. Their inventory is constantly increasing, and when the time comes for them to need some more, the business part of that has been previously established, just as in the enterprise case, right? The business part of why this phone should get to connect this PBX has already been established. No doubt, you're absolutely correct about there is a need to authenticate these requests, and there is a need for there to be an authorization decision, a policy decision at the CSP before they're executed. I don't think those problems are intractable, however. And I think we have mechanisms that can address that. What we don't have today is a mechanism that, again, would let you then get like a stir cert, right, that goes along with this number block and let you do something with it at a CSP, as you will see in the provisioning slides in a moment. Richard.
Richard Shockey. To be quite honest, John, I dislike all of this conversation. This postulates a policy. All I want to do is build tools. The tool should have requirements associated with it, which may or may not enable this particular policy construct that you're trying to put forth. So I just want to get away from this kind of discussion whatsoever, which is that the protocol requirements must be able to enable a policy construct of some way, shape, or form, or a business model to which you're describing here. We don't do policy, we don't do business models, we build tools, and the requirements that you are going to have to come up with here should say it may be able to do this, it might be able to do this, but you cannot say it must be able to do this.
Well, again, I think that's a part, right. The purpose of putting up these use cases is to inform whether we think there's an interesting problem to work on here in the IETF today. We're not going to go into whether the requirement for this or that should be must or should. I certainly agree that that is the work of the group, should we get there, but that's not our work today.
I mean, maybe I need to clean my glasses, but what I'm seeing on this slide is a technical requirement for support for delegation, not a requirement that there's any business model.
I'm just trying to give examples that, so it's not completely abstract what I'm saying, right? Okay, next slide, please. Right, and I can even imagine, I'll give another use case. Okay, maybe people don't like this is a business model, but if you just bought a new phone at the Apple Store and you want to replace an existing account, say, I think there should be a mechanism that your phone can talk directly to your CSP and get the new cert for it and get the new number for provision on the phone. Done and done. So it's really enabling things like this that I want the tool to do. So next slide. I want it to be able to do all these things at the end of the day, right? We should build a tool that is generic enough that any of these entities in this architecture can give any of the blocks of this to anybody else. And the semantics of all this will be the same wherever we're going to do it. So provided people are cool with that rough plan, and that is exactly what we mean when we say we're going to build tools here that will work irrespective of what we believe the policy outcomes are. There are a lot of likely or interesting policies that we believe can be instantiated by a model that has this flexibility, and it's that flexibility that we want to build into the charter. So if there are people who think this flexibility is problematic, that in fact we need to prevent some of these things from happening, and this goes back to my earlier kind of polarization slide, I'd like to hear about that.
Chris Wendt. Chris Wendt, Comcast. I would argue it is a vastly different scope. Having a provisioning interface to a CSP is extremely different than how you authenticate an end user client and all the security implications.
We're doing the provisioning slides next. This is the acquisition slide.
Right. Well, isn't that, you just asked the question, does anybody disagree with that premise? And I think that premise is incorrect. I mean,
the premise I said was that the scope of this should be that any of the entities in the architecture should be able to
So you're making it much more complex than the problem, the near-term problem. I think that should be solved.
Well, and again, as Henning's slide said, the near-term problems are what we're proposing not to solve here. Bluntly, I mean, if these things are applicable to the traditional or near-term problems, that's awesome. But this came out of an exercise that we went to the FCC, right, and did.
All right,
where we said,
if you're being explicit about that premise, then fine.
Okay, that is indeed, yes, that is indeed a big part of what we're talking about here.
Again, the argument here is that the tools that we're trying to develop could enable such mechanisms. However, the tools must be flexible enough to prohibit this if it is the judgment of the National Regulatory Authority or the root, they must be able to prevent it. Namely, that the construct that is being developed here is flexible enough to allow various national jurisdictions to do what they want to do.
And
But-
I don't want to design requirements today, but I'd be fine if that was a requirement in.
And I think, exactly, is
Okay.
that we are not globally enabling a technology which may not be applicable to a particular jurisdiction.
Okay. Done and done. Next slide. Let us now talk about provisioning, how we associate numbers with CSPs, and how we manage some related user data. I tried to really, again, these are super high-level sketches, give a notion of what I mean by provisioning today. Today, obviously, CSPs, they do all this themselves, basically. Like users have some limited interface with AT&T when a new customer is being turned up. Here's where I live. Here's like some other information you need about me. But really, the CSP does everything in that little loop back to itself that is required to figure out what needs to be done to turn a new customer up so that they can receive calls at a particular number. Next slide. Okay, but if we had a model that was more decoupled than that, where, say, a root authority was distributing 100 blocks of numbers, I'll use Cullen again in the back since he's there, to Cullen's PBX, I could imagine a case where Cullen gets those numbers not through a CSP, not through that trickle down, but directly from some other root authority, and then goes to a CSP and says, I'd like you to turn up these 200 numbers for me. And that CSP would then do some things internally, but they would need to get some information from the enterprise in order to be able to perform that function. They want to know what the endpoints are that'll be contacted for these. Think about it as being similar to like SIP registration, right? You would be getting the kind of information you get in a SIP registration message. You'd also, of course, need to be able to prove with some mechanism that you are authorized to receive those numbers, and this is where we see STIR fitting right into the model.
When you say SIP registration, are you suggesting you're going to tie these to IP addresses, or are you going to tie it to something which has more permanency than that?
Technically, you don't need to put IP addresses in the SIP register, in the contact of register messages. In fact, it's discouraged in our 61, if I recall, for a variety of reasons, and since GRU, it's even more discouraged, right? But,
okay. But something a bit more permanent would be preferable.
Yeah, I'm saying it's analogous to SIP registration. I'm not sure SIP registration covers everything that you need to do in that yellow line between the enterprise and the CSP. I suspect it probably doesn't, but there's some additional metadata that's going to need to be communicated through that'll help serve the whole who is / weird dimension of this. I'll have to leave before we start talking about weirds. Or okay, next slide. I could even imagine this going down to individual, right? That there's some root authority that a single user can get a single number from. And this would be a lot like the way DNS names work today, which is why it's being shown here. I go to like a registrar, I get a DNS name, but I'm not a CSP, right? I don't have a way to, a DNS server that I run that I can plug that name into. And so I go contract with some other entity, and they run that name for me. And if we were looking at DNS style models like this, yeah, that's probably how this would work. I see Henning has a comment. Is this, ooh, I just really need to get obscene with it.
And I want to point out that having had to deal with that in the domain name space is what has emerged that all of the registrars have developed private APIs which do that, because many entities don't just acquire domain names by the onesies, but require them as part of some process flow. And it's the consequence, because there is no IETF protocol that does that. Everybody has some strange and different ones. So if you switch domain name provider, you have to rewrite your whole application to do just that. And the protocol is usually not well documented, all of these problems. So this is even a problem for domain names where the solutions are currently deficient.
Fair enough. And we will try to draw on some of the existing work that's done on this here in the IETF to make sure that we can get ideas from that where appropriate. Mr. Barnes, do you have something? Mr. Sullivan.
Andrew Sullivan. I actually work in the domain name business, and it seems to me that we actually have one protocol, and it's EPP. Now, there are some extensions that every registry uses that are different among them, and certainly there's an awful lot of implementations that suck and therefore don't do this correctly. But EPP works and has been working for many years. Well, no, but I mean, when I hear somebody say, like, every time you change this, we've got a protocol.
I don't believe this is likely to be relevant to the charter discussion. If you
Just
want
to
to have
clarify
a hallway
whatever's-
talk on EPP, that's...
Just to clarify what I meant, I didn't mean the registry-registrar interaction, I meant the consumer to registrar interactions. I don't think anybody offers EPP for that.
Richard Barnes. So, yeah, I think the domain name analogy, if I'm imagining this correctly, the yellow arrow here is more like the client interacting with, if I've gotten a domain name and I'm a client, then the CSP in the domain name case is something like my web hosting provider, and I say, please set up a web service that answers for this domain name. Or my DNS hosting provider says, please provide DNS services for this name. And in a sort of analogous way, I can see this being useful. And we have got a lot of use cases today where like a messaging app or a social networking app uses a phone number as an identifier to connect different users together. And I can see a provisioning protocol like that replacing some of the like SMS-based verification that they do to bind a user ID, to bind an ID in a social networking context or a messaging context to a phone number.
But just to be clear, again, our job here today is not to pick a protocol, is not, it's to figure out if we think this is an interesting problem and assume that there is at least agree there's probably some set of things that we could rely on that might be able to accomplish a function like this. Mr. Crocker, sorry.
Dave Crocker. So I'll speak out of turn and cite Barry as raising a point which is at the core of what just took place. And I think that this goes to a working group chartering BOF because it gets to a question of scope and goals and background. And that is that it sure sounds like what's being talked about is an identifier administration system, and that there are a number of different identifiers on the net that need administration with models that are in the ballpark of similar to this. Domain names have gotten mentioned on the Jabber line, and they just got mentioned here, and it seems reasonable to me. To the extent that there is reasonable similarity in the operational administration models for these things, then it is reasonable to target similar or even identical technologies for doing the administration. In trying to scope a working group effort, having a sense of this task in those terms is not a small point. It's not a secondary point. It's a strategic point for planning the work. So I don't think we should just dismiss this issue out of hand before chartering the group.
Fair enough. I do have a beg, borrow, and steal slide at the end in which I talk about what we're going to beg, borrow, and steal. Next slide. I think we're pretty good for provisioning. So querying, or as people on the list are fond of calling it, enum bashing. No, the thing is that it hurts me. It really does when we talk about this like enum bashing. Don't I love enum as much as everybody else does? Didn't I pour my blood, sweat, and tears into this? Am I not an enum operator?
You love me, John.
I do. I'm not bashing anything. We all understand that the tools we create have certain trade-offs, certain limitations, and certain applicabilities to some things and not to others. And I think if there is some text in the Modern Problems document today that is too negative, obviously that document is not ready for working group last call. I think we have ample opportunity to amend it to make sure that we get that right, because I really don't want to be saying that there's like nothing enum does. I also don't want to rerun the dispatch session from IETF 85, where we talked about something called, next slide please, Turk. Turk was basically a proposal that we create a new query response architecture for resolving information related to telephone numbers. TERQ stands for telephone-related queries, so it's extremely broad. We wanted to be able to encompass both routing style data and administrative data in the way that Turk functioned. This was discussed at IETF 85. It was, as far as the dispatch process goes, I would say approved. We deferred on taking that to a charter and bringing that forward to a working group because we were waiting on a couple things. One of them was getting a better sense of STIR because we got a sense of how much STIR was actually going to impact what we were going to do here. Now that we have a slightly better idea of what we imagine those authorities that we see on the right will do, thanks to the way STIR is structured, I think we can get into kind of how we think Turk might be articulated today. You know, and the proposal has been we'll just drop Turk into this as that third component. And that work will be done here. There's a draft. It's draft Peterson Turk 03 or something right now. It's a pretty abstract protocol in the sense that it's mostly focused on information models that it expects you to share over various encodings, probably in HTTP. There's been some argument that we have binary encoding available for on-wire transactions, since this is a real-time call path for routing requests, and we're amenable to that. So next slide. Yeah, I think I probably just should have gone to the slide immediately. Not much protocol design would be proposed here because we are really just going to take that info model and the parts it's been split into and figure out how to map that into the other components of this that we require. Obviously, like the provisioning protocol we discussed, how you get this information up to the CSPs, that's kind of the routing-ish information that we described in Turk. A lot of the other things like you need contacts, billing addresses, compliance information, that's all what would live in the, in two special, one special case and one non-special case. It's certainly what you would need to reveal when you acquire numbers in the first place, but there's also these certain special people that want this information we'll talk about next slide. But yeah, as I say here, I intend to steal, to like go to jail for like grand larceny for the amount of work that we can draw on here. I listed a couple things there. Weirds, obviously because of RDAP, I'm interested in. The stuff that's been done in drinks, a lot of the provisioning that has been done in drinks, as Alexander brought up earlier, we can really parachute into this. I don't want to reinvent any wheels. What I want is to end up with an architecture that does all the things that Henning is interested in having done for this, right? That satisfies that in this post-IP transition environment, what's the stuff you need? To actually be able to realize telephone numbers on the internet in a way that's not anchored to the PSTN anymore. And that's the thrust of it. That is really what we propose to do here. Next slide. Yeah, so there is somebody special, and it's just worth saying this because, you know, it's another, at least small elephant that tends to be in the room. There are government entities who are going to want special access to some of the information that is in this architecture. Weirds has obviously really run into this, and our plan is to steal from them. Today, again, in RDAP Sec 12, we see full access may be granted to a special group of authenticated clients. And I'm not sure that it's really worth saying much more than that. I think that covers, as long as people understand that that's part of the implementation situation of this. I'm afraid all of the same constraints that apply in this to domain names will end up applying to any IP-based system for telephone numbers. And I think that's really the best thing we can say. If they find something better, we'll go with that. That's where we are. Next slide. Right. So ready for working group last call, right? You all guys, you read the document, you think it's awesome, we're done. Okay, maybe not. But the intent in the Modern Problems document was to help focus discussion, to get a sense of what the edges are around this. Again, I don't want to get too much into what we think some of the right protocol solutions are. I think we need to know what we're drawing on. I think we need to know that there is at least a plausible story for how we're going to get these pieces built. I think the examples that we paraded around today show that a lot of the pieces we need are actually already there. And a lot of this is just a matter of selecting them and then making sure that the proper information models are instantiated in these existing mechanisms. And that's what we're supposed to do here, right? We propose to take the challenge that that we've received to kind of examine, okay, if Martin, if your company says you're going to be out of the PSTN business, you're going to transition away from this to a pure IP environment, what do we need to do it? And that is our proposed scope here, at least when it comes to how telephone numbers are going to be handled on the internet. Questions, comments, rants, time for the fun.
Don't go away.
I'm not going anywhere.
Eric Berger, so I'm going to do this in the context of chartering, not in the context of protocol discussion.
And we do have a charter discussion after this, right?
And that is Turk presumes kind of two things. One is sort of the mother of all databases, as Henning called it, and that it's in the real-time call path, which are two things we kind of haven't ever done before. And I was wondering, from a chartering perspective, are we going to start with, say this is what we're doing and we're just going to finish it, or are we going to, visit what people would deploy?
So I would first of all say, I understand what Henning presented and why I presented it. The Turk proposal specifically is not stipulated on having the mother of all single databases. Much like the way I presented routing authorities is very much, I'm defining a root authority as somebody who doesn't get blocks on somebody else. That doesn't mean anything about who they are, what the relationship is, what information they have versus other root authorities. I imagine there will be a plurality. Similarly, I think in the Turk case, I am merely interested in creating the tools that will allow you to query these databases. I have no skin in the game of whether there should be 1 or 67 or 6,000 of those databases. And I suspect that it will be a plurality. And so, I don't see that as a gating factor on Turk that we resolve that. It's a tool. And it's a tool that I think is going to have applicability to a variety of the interesting deployment environments that are coming up in the transition. So that's why it has that property.
And the second half about being in the middle of the call path.
Well, so when it's in the middle of the call path, as I said, the way the Turk proposal reads today, we have lightweight encodings that are specific to those transactions. And they only handle a subset of the data because there is only a subset of the routing information as opposed to the administrative information associated with numbers that's required in order to execute that. So I think we have a story about if you're going to do this, obviously enum, right, is what it's supposed to compare to for performance. And that's so the contention is anyway that we believe that's achievable.
It's a totally different architecture.
It's a totally different architecture, and yet we believe that it's achievable.
I'll let others talk about that.
I agree with Eric. It's useful to call out these two different models because one may not depend on the other in a sense. They may not be provided by the same entity, for example, the same server, the caching issues come into play, for example, there because you're much more likely to have a fairly wide distribution of information in that case. I do want to highlight, however, an important distinction in that in your slides, you always had a tree shape on a directed acyclic graph. You always had a DAG in there. Was a clear flow, whether they were however many labels, however many leaves they were. And I do want to point out one of the harder pieces that I think is closer to a mechanism design as opposed to just simply JSON type stuff is indeed if we allow multiple entities, like I pointed out in my mesh model, to manage at any layer, doesn't matter whether it's up or down at the bottom, to do that, because that's my sense, generally speaking, is that there are lots of bodies out there outside the IETF that are going to be very good about defining data elements. And we know standards bodies that are much closer to industry segments, much closer to, say, the domain name industry, if you want to call it that, or in the SMS short code industry, whatever it happens to be. They'll be happy to define JSON elements, and they'll do a much better job at that than we probably could. Given our expertise, what they generally don't have the expertise of is to make correctly working protocols that do non-trivial things other than requests. And that's one where I think we can add value. And so we need to decide early on, is that a value we do want to add?
Yeah, so I will say I have no objection to having a mesh architecture that allows say, what I'm calling the root authorities in this, since I imagine them being a diverse and plural set themselves, having that mesh and being able to share with each other. And I don't know exactly what it looked like. I have no problem having that be in the scope of the work. I think it's a hard problem, though. And again, lost or there are things we've done that are comparable to that we could probably apply to it. If we want that to be a deliverable in the charter, I would not object.
Okay, Martin Dolly. Okay, so in the beginning you speak of tools, but when I listen to you and, after this presentation, it looks to me more like a solution. And then I take it further. Are we creating a solution that's in search of a policy decision? And just a concern.
Yeah, I mean, again, like I said, I think it's not a solution. That's the key point I developed back to. It is an architecture in that there are a bunch of abstract roles that are going to be instantiated in this, but there's a big difference to me between an architecture and a solution, I'll be clear. Because I'm not saying, and there's going to be 5 entities and they're going to do the following. We're going to create protocols that will enable a variety of configurations of these entities to do things to meet a variety of policies. And I think I can sit with the straight face. I do. I mean, I think this enables things in today's world as well as enabling things in some of the future scenarios that Heng's interested in. I don't think that it biases it even. I don't.
Richard Barnes, I think you've got broadly the right breakdown of the problem here. Among the 3 problems you've identified, the allocation, provisioning, and query, I think the first and the third are really the more critical ones, and they're sort of conjoined, right? They're complementary. They're mirror images of each other.
Yes.
You want to allocate allocate numbers and associate have a way to provision metadata with them. And you want to be able to then have other parties query about that, the stuff that you've provisioned with the registry. It's a little less clear to me that the interaction with of the act of provisioning things out to some communication service is a critical element of the scope here, because it seems like that could vary quite a bit depending on the communication service you're talking to. So, if there was any issue around that, I think that might be something that could be separated out from the charter here.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the reason why it's there is because exactly the information that you get from the acquisition protocol, the number itself and the credentials associated with the numbers are the things that need to be fed into that. And so I think we want to create an architecture where if there are going to be CSPs out there that are going to work in this post-transition environment, there's going to be a standard set of information that they're going to require from someone to run their number for them. And if we don't set that bar, I'm afraid that, again, what's the point of having an acquisition protocol if you can't then take it to a CSP and expect that they'll know what to do with it and that it'll be sufficient for them to do what they need to do. So that's why it's there. Now, you can tell me if that's a good argument or not. Is that Mr. Newton?
Yes, it is.
Under that hat, I barely recognize you.
Andy Newton, I just want to make a comment about the beg, borrowing, and stealing thing. That seemed to be a list of protocols that don't look alike, and in my experience, unless there's a lot of implementations of those protocols, borrowing them is not that great. We have this other problem in the IETF that we tried to solve called routing security, and we developed a whole set of things that beg, borrowed, and stole from all sorts of areas, and the result was an extremely ugly set of specifications.
Yeah, and Stir is pretty much doing the same thing, right? I mean, literally, they're building RPKI for telephone numbers, and so we've already had that over there. I am very sympathetic, and yeah, when we get down to the protocol selection, hopefully we'll make wiser decisions than have been made in the past.
Chris Went.
Real quick, for the purpose of being able to look at the charter and have discussions around it, I want to go ahead and cut the line after Peter.
Chris Went. I agree with.
No. Don't get out of line. Sorry.
I agree with what Martin said about the solution part. I think a lot of this architecture is sort of like a web services architecture. You talk to any front-end, back-end developer, he could probably code this up in a few weeks. We actually have proposed something that handles most of this stuff in Addis. I know a few people are aware of that in the testbed effort. We're going to open source a solution actually that will cover a lot of these functionalities. And it's built basically all on web tools. Even the authentication part, if you want to extend this to users, there's plenty of tools out there, OAuth and other things that will help with the security part. So I agree that there's the policy part that has to be changed in order to come to this framework, but the actual development of a technical solution involves basically just defining the solution. I think all the tools already exist to create this thing.
Pretty much, yeah. And to be clear, I mean, I expect that we would be coordinating with ADIS and with the other people that are interested in this. I mean, again, this all came out of the same thing, right? I mean, after the FCC workshop, you know, Henning came to us and asked us to start a modern list, and, you know, I understand the ADIS efforts in this. We're also looking at that test bed dimension that we discussed. We're not really in, like, the little test bed business here in the IETF. So, I mean, I think it's a valuable thing that ADIS is doing. If there is, however, new protocol work that's going to be required for integrating this stuff in with SIP and things like that, which may be the case, I think there's a very good argument to be made that we do that in the IETF, right?
Yeah, I'm just arguing on scope, like what is the scope of this group and is it necessary?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Kathy and I'm from Consumers Union and I'm not a technologist. I actually picked up a line from the first presentation. We can make it harder to spoof and easier to port than it is today. And my question is this the group that's doing that for consumers?
Yeah,
No.
so STIR is the group that...
That's the
Yeah.
I'm in
So
the
come
right
this afternoon.
I'm in the right conference, but
I'll be standing in front of the room in STIR giving a different presentation that will have a very similar tone, in which I'll be talking about robocalling, voicemail hacking, swatting, and...
But isn't
Yes.
that also related to the allocation of phone numbers? And
It
could
is, well, that's
somebody
the point.
tell
Yeah,
me?
we think this is all part and parcel of this. Hey, Henning, if you want to... Yeah.
Maybe I should explain what I meant by that is
Yes.
there's really two pieces there, namely, as John also explained, is if we do our job well, it will be easier to store credentials in the new database than it is today, which will indirectly facilitate the work of the other working group and indirectly get to what you care about. If we do our job well as we will at least enable better porting mechanisms that then it's up to the regulators to actually do. So, for example, non-geographic porting, for those who know what that means, has both a technical component, it relies on a lot of legacy stuff that's in the existing weight centers and all of that, and it has a very large, somebody has to say that that's okay not to do that, port outside a weight center. That's not, the latter is completely outside this building in that. But the goal is that we build, as many people have said, tools which make things possible, and it is your job, so to say, and the job of the policymakers to then apply those tools that they actually benefit consumers. We can only do the tools. We can't actually nail into the board to make it actually happen.
So can I ask a follow-up question? This process I've heard people describe as being long, various descriptions of how long. I'm wondering if there's a sort of channel by which decisions get placed on a sort of, you know, we need to stop talking about this and decide to do A or B. Like, how does that happen?
Actually, yeah, I'm going to say...
Because people are really like, it's more than an annoyance, as you well know. It's become the spoofing has become a real significant harm to people. And so we're just trying to understand, like, are we 20 years away from a resolution? Are we, 18 months away from a resolution?
It's probably more realistic
No.
like that. If we could have someone, actually, if we could just take this, like, after the slot.
Okay,
Talk to you about that.
all right.
And others would be as well.
Thank you.
My general take is, if we...
So Colin Jennings, I'm with Cisco. As part of my day job, we build lots of enterprise PBXs and the phones that goes around with those. Now, building on the level of annoyance and seeing this done sooner rather than later, I mean, if there was a good protocol that allowed us to get these numbers in the way we're describing here, we would definitely be implementing it. It makes a major difference to the operational expense of doing these systems. Playing around with this stuff sort of over faxes and emails and whatever to get things set up in enterprise is a major source of errors and configuration mistakes. So this makes a real big difference in that type of environment. I think that pretty much most of the other vendors in this space would say exactly the same thing, that if this was available and that they could get CSPs to work with them on getting this information, this is really useful. So we'd certainly rather see it happen faster than sooner, preferably less than 18 months.
Peter Thatcher. So Colin may have answered half my question, but we talk a lot about building tools and not affecting policy. So how do we avoid the situation where we build lots of tools and no one uses them? Or another way of saying it is, who do we expect is actually going to use the tools? I think Colin mentioned that they would like to implement it, but then they would be waiting for CSPs to actually use them or provide an interface. So is it realistic to expect people will actually use these tools, or how do we avoid no one using the tools?
I think the mic lines were cut, Richard.
Yeah, we want to go ahead and look at the charter before we have anything.
I mean, I will say that there are some carriers and regulators in this room, and that probably they could give you some insight into the urgency that they see surrounding this.
Okay, well, I'd like to hear about that later if possible.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Feel free to sit down. Thank you.
So, time to go over the charter. I've divided it into 3 sections here, and we can go through them section by section. There's a section that's a background, section that's a goal of what would be a working group, and section what would be deliverables if there was a working group. To avoid awkward silence, I'll just read each slide. They're not that long. Modern working group will define a set of internet-based mechanisms for the purposes of managing and resolving telephone numbers in an IP environment. Existing mechanisms for these purposes face obsolescence as the voice communications infrastructure evolves to IP technology and new applications for telephone numbers become possible. The traditional model of a telephone number having association to a single service provider and a single application is breaking down. Its use as a network locator is going away, but its use as an identifier for an individual or an organization will remain for some time. Devices, applications, and network tools increasingly need to manage telephone numbers, including requesting and acquiring telephone number delegations from authorities.
Barry?
This is Barry Lieba. So Dave channeled me before. I'll channel myself now. Nothing that's been presented here has convinced me that limiting this to telephone numbers is a good idea. There are none of the arguments for why we should be using telephone numbers as a thing that takes us into the future work for me. It's very clear that we need telephone numbers, so I'm not suggesting that we eliminate them. I'm suggesting that we broaden the scope of this to more general identifiers, not limit it to telephone numbers. Allow it to be extensible at the very least, and keep that in as part of the scope.
Okay, yeah. 18 months is what Cullen just said, yeah. Oceans, boil, etc. Pressing problem. People lean on us, fix, please. I just don't see it. I just don't see it, man. I mean, this is enough of a problem as it is, just to deal with this. And it's precipitated by a specific historical circumstance that this transition is coming. And that's really what's motivated us to come and bring this and say, let's get the tools that seem to be required for this transition, which AT&T is saying 2018, right? For when they want to be out of the PSTN business.
Ben Campbell. I was also going to use the word boiling ocean, although Barry and I had a short conversation earlier where it may be just a question of how big of an ocean you're boiling. The thing I see here, though, is that we have a situation that is rather specific to telephone numbers with the transition to the IP network. And we have a big community of interest around telephone numbers who may or may not, depending on how the charter discussion goes, feel that there's a problem to solve here. So I guess the counter argument to let's generalize is you ain't going to need it. And I can see that it might make sense to have some concept of extensibility, but I'm also concerned that we don't try to make this effort any bigger than it needs to be.
Eric Berger, actually I would offer it's not let's not boil the ocean thing, because if there was a way of handling generic identifiers we could assign, that's great. The thing is, and it's the thing that everyone keeps saying, oh no, it's not about it, it's not about it, it's not about it, but the thing that's unique about telephone numbers is that they have a whole ton of policy and laws and regulation and national authorities and stuff like that that actually does make them different. And I think that in fact when we come up with this toolkit, and as John said, this toolkit needs to deal with the United States, which has this unique North American numbering plan with multiple countries and numbers that you pay for and don't pay for and you don't know and you do know, versus other countries where it's very clear. We need to actually, we both reduce the amount of ocean to boil and, by the way, have this solution that fits in this regulatory regime.
Stick in a thing there. So there's already going to be a lot of stuff to deal with different regulations in different places.
If it's going to be successful and if anyone's going to use it, you have to. If it's going to be an academic exercise, then you don't. I like it.
So, again, in the interest of time, we're going to cut the line after Barry, and I would request that everyone keep their comments brief.
So Keith Drage.
Sorry, Martin. What did I say? Oh, sorry. I meant Martin.
So Keith Drage, I mean, in response to Barry, I would ask, does he mean that he wants a single mechanism for controlling two separate databases, each of which contain their own type of identifier, or is he talking about a mechanism managing a combined database of all identifiers? But the point I wanted to make is, up here we're talking about telephone numbers. Can we be more specific and say, do you actually mean E164 generated numbers? Because there's other things that do look like telephone numbers but are not. For example, E212. Does this include those or not?
This did mean E164 numbers. Probably should have been more specific.
Steve, you could take that as a comment.
Dave Crocker, so it sounds like there's some reactions that might not be right. The line is cut. So the problem with what's up there, and I suspect what comes after it, is by saying telephone number, it is defining a sandbox with masses of assumptions that are not stated. And so the reference to regulatory and policy issues, I think, is a version of that. And that absent any indication of what those details are, chartering a working group that has not called out what the special constraints are that make telephone numbers different from domain names. I don't know if folks have noticed, but some domain names are under very strict regulations, others very loose, lots of complexity in that world, lots of complexity in this world. I'm sure they're quite different. I haven't a clue how. It's not stated in this charter. It's not stated in anything that's been discussed so far. You have a large operational environment. I get that. You have a lot of history and you have good motivation. That's fine. But this hasn't actually been making statements about what is specific to this task that's different from the task of other kinds of identifiers. And for reference, what was said at the mic did not do any of that. I was in the room, I listened. I understand you were laying lots of stuff out. I'm telling, what was just said before me was a general statement of there's lots of details.
Okay, Dave, I believe you've made a point. Is that the one you're coming to make? I mean, so I'm going to ask you to...
What point do you think I made?
The point that you're making is that you believe that telephone numbers are not sufficiently distinct to warrant chartering a group, and Or if they are, that needs to be more clearly expressed in the charter. Is that a good summary?
It's in the ballpark.
Okay.
So the tendency to say boil the ocean is a nice way of dismissing a significant point about lack of clarity of what this work is and how it differs from potentially related work.
Thank you.
Pete Resnick, I'm going to go in the other direction, and mostly by way of a question. I see the words the traditional model breaking down, uses network locator going away. That seems to say that trying to reinstantiate everything that Henning was talking about in the current architecture is kind of a silly process. Why aren't we doing less? Seems like a goal of this working group might be chop down that architecture to what's actually needed to go forward and not reinstantiate all of the morass that we currently have. Is that a possibility? And being now dotless, would the IASG be okay with this working group taking on chopping down that architecture to the minimum needed in the working group?
Okay, so Martin Dolly, the concern I had before is that this looks like a solution. I mean, as Chris mentioned at the mic, there are other solutions addressing this problem as well as the spoofing problem, whereby it has a different architectural model that would, the certificate, so the service provider authenticates the user associated with that service provider, and that the query would actually go back to the service provider associated with that user versus a centralized model. And so when we're talking here, we're talking business models, and we're talking about defining solutions waiting for a policy to occur. And, at the end of the day, there's a point at which this is business, and there's going to be winners and losers, and is it the role of the IETF to be defining a solution that prejudices whether who's going to win and who's going to lose? I thought the line was ended.
Take my dots away. No, I think it's outrageous. I do. I mean, yes, you can see there are certainly other forums that are looking at this.
John,
I know you're upset about it.
John.
Next one. Okay. All right, next slide is goals. It's broken down into 3 paragraphs. The working group will define a framework for the roles and functions involved in managing and resolving telephone numbers in an IP environment. This includes a protocol mechanism for acquiring telephone numbers, which will provide an enrollment process for the individuals and entities that use and manage telephone numbers. Telephone numbers may either be managed in a hierarchical tree or in a distributed peer-to-peer architecture. Privacy of the enrollment data and security of the resource will be primary considerations. Second paragraph, additionally, the working group will deliver a protocol mechanism for resolving telephone numbers, which will allow entities such as service providers, devices, and applications to access data related to telephone numbers, possibly including calling name data, maintaining reliability, real-time application performance, security, and privacy are primary considerations. Working group will take into considerations existing IETF work, including enum, spearmint, and drinks. Third paragraph, the work of this group is limited to specifying a solution for telephone numbers and covers any service that can be addressed using a telephone number. Expanding the work to other identifiers is out of scope. Solutions and mechanisms created by the working group will be flexible enough to accommodate different policies, for example, by different regulatory agencies.
Pete Resnick, this is probably the better slide to have gotten up on. It's that first paragraph that I'm concerned about, because it's mushing framework and protocol and doesn't mention whether there's an architecture discussion. And I'm inclined to go big and say that the first goal should be a framework and architecture discussion in the group. I don't know if that's desirable by everybody else. I'm certainly willing to be beaten back about that, but that do the framework and architecture, then get down to the protocols, and that sort of crushes them into one sort of thing to do.
Yeah, so I think you're speaking probably more towards even the third slide. We talked about deliverables, but yeah. Exactly.
Well, Eric, I would offer that can be addressed by this slide here. So I'm waiting for this slide.
Yeah. So,
Can you finish presenting the full charter before we open the mic line again?
Sorry. This is the last of the charter here, so.
Okay, the work group will deliver the following: an architecture overview document that includes high-level requirements and security privacy considerations, document describing the enrollment process for existing and new telephone numbers, including any modifications to metadata related to those telephone numbers, a document describing protocol mechanisms for accessing contact information associated with enrollments, document describing mechanisms for resolving information related to telephone numbers.
And now we're taking comments?
Yes. Yep.
I don't see a deliverable that says anything about business models or solutions. And I don't think anyone's going to get up and say that we need one. I understand other fora out there do that, and we don't. We're building tools. Really. Look at what these things are. They're tools. They're going to work with a variety of different outcomes. So,
Chris,
put that in the charter, sure.
Chris, if we're talking about going to working group last call today, can we just take Henning's architecture and call it a day?
Yeah, I knew the dispatch process was intended to make things faster, but maybe we can do it with the BOF, right? Direct from charter discussion to working group last call.
Publish the slide. So yeah.
Andrew Sullivan, if it's really important to people to put a sentence in an IETF working group charter that we don't do business models, I think we're already well down a rat hole. But I don't mind doing it if that will disperse that problem. I think the key thing here is that we do need to be very, very clear that the IETF is not painting the alternative policy-making forum target on ourselves, and I want to make sure my reading of the charter is that it's perfectly clear about that, or the proposed charter. But if there's any doubt about that, I would like to know exactly where that doubt comes from, and then we can add a sentence to address that particular thing.
Pete Resnick, going back one slide. So I get the deliverables of that architecture document, that's fine, but I'm going to go back to that first paragraph. I'm happy to propose some text, but is anybody going to be okay with the idea that we're doing architecture, that we're not just writing down what the current architecture is, but we're deciding on different architecture in this room? That's the question I'm asking.
Okay, so Eric Berger, so I actually, see that A, we're not saying anything about business models. B, we're not saying anything about being necessarily in the call path with this charter. What I saw before actually did say have some solutions in mind. This, to me, leaves it open. I just wanted to get a sense of, am I not reading too much into this, and that we actually have decided we're going to do stuff in real time in the call path, or that with this charter as written means that you could have more approaches that follow what we has been working today.
Colin Jennings again. I just want to point out that standardization is very much needed here. We're already seeing a real need for this, a need so big, in fact, that several different companies have built proprietary solutions where you can go use some REST API call on the web today to go get yourself a phone number. And that type of fragmentation isn't helping people at all. So, there's people building both ends of this already in ways where they're doing it across a much smaller set than they could if we could do it in a standardized way. So we need to do this. We need to do it sooner than later.
Peter Kordenik, could you go back a slide, please? So in the third paragraph, it said that the solutions will be flexible enough to accommodate different policies and so on and so forth, especially by different regulatory agencies. I don't see that reflected in the deliverables. That would include for me some policy survey or something Otherwise, you end up with a solution that is so super flexible that it can do anything, which is probably not very valuable. So, or are we actually addressing a +1 numbering space problem only?
So this is a valid concern. I mean, and Eric kind of raised this on the list as well. So yeah, we definitely are trying to create the tools. I would be very averse to doing a survey of policies and treating that, say, as a requirements document, in part, again, because the purpose of the exercise we're doing here is to explore something that's happening, that's ongoing and complicated and transitioning right now. And we're trying to find, again, the set of tools we think will accommodate the most of the likely and interesting architectures that would be required to solve this. And I don't want to do that by looking at what governments want and then saying, okay, we're going to go from that. And I think these tools are flexible enough to do that. I really think having, what would it mean to have IETF consensus on a document that was a policy survey, right? It's not an internet trend.
So, in the interest of being able to ask the questions to inform the area director, we're going to cut the line at whoever's at the back here. If it's Eric or Richard, or I don't know if Richard's in line. You're in line, okay.
To Peter's point, you are absolutely right. It would be very, very nice if we had a general sense of how the national regulatory authorities felt about this sort of stuff. If you would like to hire a consultant to write a report for you on that, I'm certainly available one way or the other. But I can speak with some authority on how national regulatory authorities outside the United States have been looking at this. They are struggling with this. They have arcane systems that are even older than the ones in North America, and that is saying something. So it is a perfectly valid idea. I just don't know how to do it.
So again, Henning speaking, down level, this a little bit into more concrete action items. I think it would be the one point when I was putting together my material where I think it would be useful, and this goes to the architecture discussion and defining the players and what they do to who does what to whom type of thing, is to get a better sense of in the current reporting style relationship, which is a general sense of saying when a record privileges transition from one entity to another, what are kind of the abstract ways of doing that so that we could accommodate that, because that affects what kind of publications and interaction models are necessary. I would, however, and this goes back to an earlier discussion, say the following, if we are successful, we won't actually have a fully ready to deploy solution that a numbering administrator contractor could just simply hand to their coder and say, go build, dear web developer, use Python to do some web stuff. What will likely have to happen is that just like you see today, and if you look at the NPAC protocol specification documents, in that they take existing protocols and say how they're used to implement certain business processes. And so somebody else will do that. We just have to have the right tools that they don't suddenly find themselves without the right screwdriver.
Thanks. Richard, keep it to 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, just wanted to touch back on Peter's point, which I think is exactly the right question to be asking. Like, who's the consumers of this? Who's going to write code to these specs? I think Colin had a good starting point. I think the other thing to observe is that we're seeing a lot of systems now that are trying to provide a more unified experience between a phone-based thing and a more traditional internet-based thing, my employer included. And I think that's a space where there's a lot of active interest and a space where these tools would be really helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, so Eric Berger, coming in, and in fact, even a lot of the charter is about how do we get numbers from national authorities or their designates or whatever. What I'm hearing from Colin is in the multi-campus, multi-vendor enterprise thing, there's something that looks almost the same as John had his architecture thing. And this might be useful work for that use case, and that if we can do it in 10 seconds, that would be awesome. And in the same with self-promotion department, yes, the Center for Business and Public Policy in the CERC also would love to take your commission report on what the world's doing.
Thanks. Okay, so we do have some questions we want to run through for Ben's benefit to sort of feed into the decision we're going to make here. Modulo, obviously, we've run out of time, there is a little more conversation to have that we're going to have on the list that will also inform the decisions that he will make, along with the rest of the IESG. But we have these to run through very quickly, because bear with us running over maybe a minute or two.
Is there support to form a working group with the proposed charter?
We're going to take, yeah, so we're going to go ahead and we'll take a hum at that. So those who believe that there is support to form a working group with the charter amended according to the conversation that we've had in here. I think that we're close enough that there's support for this. Please hum now. I'm asking, yes or no on all of these. Yes. So if you support that, please hum now. Okay. If you do not support that, please hum now. I'll let Ben make a decision on that.
I think it was a little heavier on the support side, but there was definitely some people on the
Okay. Number two?
Yep. Does the community think that the problem statement is clear, well-scoped, solvable, and useful to solve?
If you believe this, please hum yes now. If you disagree with the statement, please hum now. Okay.
There was some extra loud hummers,
I think it's definitely in question. Yeah, that's.
No, we're quite good at it. Everybody else.
Yes. So, as just information, I would like to see a show of hands of people who are willing to review documents produced by the working group. I'm calling that in as probably about 20 or so, just rough estimate.
Who would be willing to serve as an editor of working group documents?
Show of hands again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I see on the order of 5 or 6. Okay.
Community think that given the charter discussion, a work group should be formed?
Do you want to continue with this, Ben? Okay. So let's go ahead and take a hum. Those in favor, now. Those opposed, now. Okay.
So I'm hearing that people interested in the work group of the charter is not necessarily what
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
That is what we're trying to say.
Okay. All right. Shall we continue, Ben? Do you need more information? Shall we continue? There's a sixth one.
Isn't that the same thing? Yeah.
Yeah. So that's 5 and 6. You're right.
Yep.
Okay. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, spending your morning with us. If you did not sign the blue sheet, please do come up here and add your name.
What's that? Oh, okay, great. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
How would you distinguish that with the goals?
So it is, I would say on the delivery, the architecture overlay.
Don't say that. Don't say that.
A description of the protocol, and that way if you decide that you want to make the protocol document and this one the same document,